The smell hit her first, motor oil and something older beneath it. The particular mineral sharpness of metal that had been worked and reworked across decades. Diane Hargrove, CEO of Hargrove Maritime Solutions, stepped to the concrete floor of the Coastal Classic Car Auctions staging bay and pulled her jacket lapel slightly away from her body, as if proximity to the smell might leave a mark. She was 44, polished in the way that required maintenance, and she had arrived with 2 assistants and a bidding paddle she did not intend to use. She had come to be seen at the right event. The man crouching beside the covered shape in Bay 7 had not noticed her. He was adjusting something beneath a canvas tarp, and his forearms were dark with grease to the elbow. "You smell like motor oil," Diane said, loudly enough that the 2 men beside her heard it. She glanced at the covered shape, and whatever's under that tarp smells worse. The man looked up. He did not answer. His eyes were steady and dark, and he held a small torque wrench in his right hand, the way a person holds something they have used 10,000 times. He looked at her for exactly 1 moment, then looked back at the car. His name was Daniel Marsh. He was 38 years old, and he ran a small engine repair shop on the edge of Portsmouth called Marsh & Son, though there was no son. He did not advertise. He did not have a website. He charged fairly, and he did good work, and almost no one in that auction bay knew anything else about him. What Diane Hargrove did not know, what almost no one in that room knew, was that 6 years earlier, Daniel Marsh had held the position of Chief Restoration Engineer at Callaway Coachworks in Newport, one of the most respected automotive restoration houses in the country, a firm whose client list included 3 sitting senators, a foreign head of state, and the United States Navy. He had held 2 patents on period-accurate casting methods. He had been written about in Automobile Quarterly under the headline, "The Quiet Perfectionist." He had walked away from all of it in January of the year his wife Claire died because his daughter Nora was 4 years old, and she needed a parent who came home. Stay with this one all the way through. Every detail is here for a reason. The object beneath the tarp was a 1951 Packard 200 4-door sedan, chassis number 24518847, and it had been sitting in a warehouse in Gloucester for 31 years. It was not beautiful. Not yet. Daniel Marsh had grown up in his father's garage, in the particular school of attention that garages teach, the kind of school that has no graduation, only increasing precision. His father, Raymond Marsh, had been a machinist at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard for 30 years, a man who believed that objects told the truth about the people who made them, if you look long enough. Raymond had died when Daniel was 26, leaving him a set of snap-on tools, a 1967 Ford pickup, and a discipline for looking that Daniel had never been able to set down. He had met Claire at a restoration trade show in Boston, where she had been photographing cars for a design publication. She was sharp-eyed and direct, and she had looked at the car he was restoring that weekend, a 1938 Buick Century, and said it was the most honestest thing she had seen all day. He had proposed 14 months later in his father's garage beside the truck because it seemed like the right place. They were married for 6 years. Nora was born in the 4th year. Claire died of an aneurysm on a Tuesday morning in February, without warning, without time for anything. She was 33. Daniel had been at the shop when it happened. He had not been there. He closed Callaway Coachworks' Newport operation the following month, declined the offer to transfer to the San Francisco branch, and moved back to Portsmouth. He rented a bay on Clement Street, bought used equipment, and opened Marsh & Son. He was not hiding. He was not punishing himself. He was making sure that Nora had a father who was present, who came home at a predictable hour, who was there for the ordinary days that turned out to matter most. The work was smaller now. He did not mind. He was still doing the work. Nora was 7. She carried a small stuffed rabbit named Biscuit everywhere she went. A gray rabbit with one ear slightly longer than the other, which she had named for its color when it was new, and had never updated the name after it faded. She came to the shop on Saturdays and did her reading at the folding table near the back, and sometimes she watched her father work and asked questions that were entirely literal, and occasionally stopped him cold. She had asked once, watching him sand a panel for the 3rd hour in a row, why he kept doing the same thing. He had told her he was looking for something. She had considered this and said, "Is it in there?" He had said he thought so. She had gone back to her book. The Packard had come to him through a phone call from a man named Gerald Fitch, a retired harbor pilot in his late 70s, who had stored the car in his family's warehouse since 1993, the year his brother died, and left it to him. Gerald had not driven it. He had not sold it. He had paid the storage fees every year without examining why. And when his daughter finally asked him what he intended to do with the old Packard, he had found Daniel Marsh's name through a machinist in Portsmouth who said simply that Marsh was the man you called when the work mattered. Gerald had called on a Wednesday. Daniel had driven to Gloucester on Thursday, spent 2 hours under the car and inside the engine bay, and driven home. He had told Gerald he would take the commission. The Coastal Classic car auction was 4 months away. Gerald's escorter had arranged the consignment, believing, as Gerald did, that the car deserved to be seen by people who understood what it was. What it was, beneath 31 years of warehouse air and surface oxidation, was a Packard 200 with its original 208 cubic inch straight 8 engine, its factory 2-tone paint scheme in Corinthian beige over Brewster green, and its interior in a state of preservation that Daniel had not expected and had not mentioned to anyone, because he needed to see what was actually there before he said a word about it. The auction house had assigned the Packard a pre-sale estimate of $8,000 to $12,000. They had based this on photographs taken before Daniel had touched it. They had not asked him for an assessment. He had not offered one. Diane Hargrove had attended the Coastal Classic for 3 consecutive years as a matter of social positioning. She sat on 2 charitable boards, whose donor circles overlapped with the auction's regular buyers, and she understood the event as a networking instrument rather than a market. She did not know cars. She knew what cars signaled, which was a different and, in her experience, sufficient knowledge. She had arrived in Bay 7 because her assistant Marcus had pointed out the covered shape, and they said it had drawn some attention from the floor staff. Diane had looked at the man crouching beside it and formed her assessment in approximately 4 seconds. She said what she said about the motor oil, and the man looked up and did not respond. And she moved on to the next bay, where a 1969 Corvette sat on a display platform under good lighting, looking exactly like what people expected a valuable car to look like. Marcus stayed behind for a moment. He was 26 and had grown up in a family that restored furniture, and he had learned from that education to look at things more carefully than most people his age. He looked at the tarp, then at the man's hands, then at the tools arranged on the cloth beside the car, each one placed with a precision that was not performative, that was simply the way a person placed tools, when the placement was a habit of mind rather than a display. Marcus looked at the man's face, which was calm and focused and entirely unbothered by what Diane had said. He made a note in his phone, not about the car, about the man. He did not mention it to Diane. The morning after the auction bay encounter, Daniel arrived at Clement Street at 6:45. The garage light came on with a click and a flicker, the fluorescent tubes warming from violet to white over the course of 30 seconds, and the Packard sat in the center bay under its tarp, waiting. He pulled the tarp back, folded it, and set it on the shelf. He stood at the front of the car for a long moment, looking at it the way his father had taught him to look at things, not cataloging, not planning, just seeing. Then he put on his apron and began. The work that followed was not dramatic. It was not fast. It was the kind of work that looks from the outside like very little happening, and is, from the inside, a continuous sequence of decisions, each of which depends on the one before it. Daniel did not rush decisions. He did not make them prematurely. He gathered information first, and he gathered it with the patience of someone who had learned through years of expensive mistakes made by other people and corrected by him, that the cost of a wrong decision in restoration work was always paid later, always paid in full, and always with interest. He spent the first 3 days doing nothing but documentation. He photographed every panel from every angle, in natural light and in the shop's overhead fluorescence. He crawled beneath the car with a flashlight and a mirror and a notebook, and he recorded what he found in a handwriting that was small and precise and covered 4 pages by the end of day 1. He pulled the engine bay inspection panel and shone the light into corners that had not seen light in 3 decades. He found what he expected to find, or surface rust on unpainted metal, dried gaskets, a cracked vacuum line. And he found one thing he had not expected. On the firewall, behind the original wiring loom, someone had affixed a small brass plate, hand-stamped, with the Packard factory inspector's mark and a date. October 14th, 1951. Beside it, in a hand that had pressed hard enough to leave an impression in the metal itself, was a set of initials, RTW. Daniel photographed the plate from 6 angles. He did not touch it. He made a note and moved on. Day 4. He began disassembly. Methodical, labeled, every fastener bagged and marked with masking tape and a marker, every component photographed before removal and after. His friend Pete Okafor arrived at 7 in the morning on day 4 without being asked, set his coffee on the workbench, and put on a spare apron. Pete was 41, a former aircraft mechanic who now ran a small avionics repair business 2 streets over, and he and Daniel had worked alongside each other on 3 previous restorations without ever formally agreeing to. He did not ask about the fee. He showed up and he worked. And when he had a question, he asked it quietly and listened to the answer completely before touching anything. Nora came on Saturday of the first week. She set Biscuit on the folding table, opened her reading book, and read for 40 minutes. Then she put the book down and watched her father and Pete remove the Packard's rear quarter panel with the careful steadiness of surgeons. After a while, she said, "Is that the sick part?" Daniel said it was one of them. She looked at it. "It doesn't look that sick," she said. "Not from here," he said. She picked up Biscuit and went back to her book. He did not explain. He did not need to. The panel beneath its surface oxidation had a stress fracture along the lower seam that would not have been visible from any angle that did not involve removing it entirely and holding it under direct light at a 17-degree angle. He had found it on day 3. He had said nothing about it to Gerald Fitch, because there was nothing to say yet. He would know what it meant when he had looked at it long enough. That was always how it worked. You looked until you knew, and then you worked. The stress fracture in the rear quarter panel turned out to be the beginning of a longer conversation with the car. Daniel spent day 5 and day 6 with the panel on the workbench under the shop's secondary light, a portable halogen he angled at 17 degrees and then adjusted in small increments, reading the metal the way his father had taught him to read it, not as damage, but as information. The fracture ran 11 centimeters along the lower seam weld, the kind of crack that forms not from impact but from decades of thermal expansion and contraction in an unheated space, metal breathing in and out across 31 winters until something gave. It was not catastrophic. It was, in fact, repairable to a standard that would leave no evidence it had ever existed. But it required a specific sequence, and the sequence required patience. And patience required that he not begin until he was certain he understood what he was looking at. He was certain on the morning of day 7. Pete arrived at 7:15. Daniel had already been there an hour. The coffee was made and the MIG welder was warmed and the panel was clamped in the jig at an angle they had discussed the previous afternoon without needing to discuss again. Pete looked at the setup, looked at Daniel, and picked up his gloves. They worked for 4 hours without speaking in any way that required words. The kind of silence that falls between two people who have worked together long enough that the work itself is the conversation. Nora came on Saturday of the second week. She set Biscuit on the folding table, not on the chair this time, which meant she intended to sit in the chair and watch. She watched for 20 minutes while Daniel applied the first skim coat of filler to the repaired seam, his hand moving in long, unhurried arcs. Then she said, "Is that the part that was broken?" Daniel said it was. She studied it. "It looks the same as the other parts now," she said. "That's the idea, he said. She considered this for a moment with the seriousness she brought to most things. "So you fixed it so it looks like it was never broken," she said. Not a question. A conclusion she had arrived at on her own. Daniel said yes. She picked up Biscuit, held him against her chest, and looked at the panel for another long moment. "I think that's a good thing to know how to do," she said. Then she went back to her book. He did not say anything. He smoothed the filler with the edge of the spreader and did not say anything at all. Day 9 brought the engine. He had been anticipating the engine, the way a surgeon anticipates an operation that is technically demanding, but well within his training. Not with dread, but with a focused attention that had been building since the first day he had looked into the bay and seen what was there. The 2 8/8 cubic inch straight 8 was Packard's own design, a unit that had been engineered in an era when longevity was a selling point rather than a liability. And this one had been preserved in the way that warehouse storage sometimes preserves things, by simple inactivity. The cylinders were not scored. The bores were within tolerance. The crankshaft showed surface oxidation, but no pitting. What it needed was not rebuilding. It needed cleaning, new seals, a valve job, fresh bearings, and the kind of patient reassembly that honored what had been built the first time. He did not rush it. He did not cut it short. On day 12, while he was cleaning the carburetor at the bench, his phone rang. It was Gerald Fitch calling to ask how things were going. Daniel told him the engine was in good condition and the bodywork was progressing. Gerald asked if there was anything he should know. Daniel said he would call when there was. Gerald said that was fine. He sounded like a man who had learned at some point in his long life that some things were better left to people who knew what they were doing. The call lasted 4 minutes. Daniel went back to the carburetor. On day 15, he pulled the interior. The upholstery was original broadcloth in a color that had once been a warm gray-green and had faded toward something closer to old bone. It was fragile in the way that old fabric is fragile, not rotted, but tired, the fibers holding their weave by habit rather than strength. He removed each piece with the care of someone handling something that could not be replaced, which it could not. He photographed each piece before removal. He labeled each piece in pencil on the backing, a marking that would not show when it was reinstalled. The headliner came down in one piece, which he had not expected and which he noted in his book without comment. Beneath the rear seat cushion, in the gap between the cushion pan and the floor, he found a folded piece of paper. It had been there long enough that the fold lines were permanent. The paper itself the color of old cream. He unfolded it carefully. It was a handwritten note, in a script that was careful and slightly formal, the kind of handwriting that belonged to a person who had been taught penmanship as a discipline. It read, "For Margaret, who deserved better than she got, and who loved this car more than anyone knew. RTW, November 1951. Daniel held the note for a long moment. Then he photographed it, placed it in a glassine envelope, and set it on the shelf above the workbench next to his notes. He did not mention it to Pete. He would, eventually. But first he needed to think about what it meant. And thinking, for Daniel Marsh, was a quiet and unhurried process that could not be compressed. The initials matched the firewall plate. RTW had been in this car, had pressed his mark into the metal, and left a note beneath the seat, and had done both in November 1951, which was 1 month after the factory inspector's stamp. The car had been new. Someone had put a message inside it within a month of its leaving the factory, and that message had traveled 31 years in a warehouse and arrived now here in this shop on Clement Street in the hands of a man who understood that objects told the truth about the people who made them if you looked long enough. He looked at the note one more time before he turned off the light that evening. Then he locked the shop and drove home. On day 18, Pete came in at 7 and found Daniel already at the engine stand, talking the head bolts in sequence with the kind of measured steadiness that meant he had been at it for at least an hour. Pete poured his coffee, put on his apron, and began laying out the valve cover gaskets without being asked. They worked through the morning with the radio on low, a station that played older music, the kind that did not demand attention. At 11:47, Daniel set the torque wrench down, stepped back from the engine, and said, "She'll run." Pete looked at the engine. He nodded once. "She'll run," he agreed. That was the full extent of the conversation. Day 22. The bodywork was finished. Daniel had blocked the panels by hand, a process that had taken 4 days, and had left his forearms aching in the evenings in a way he did not mention to anyone. The surface was ready for a primer. He mixed the epoxy primer by weight, not by eye, because weight was precise and eye was not, and he applied it in 3 coats with a spray gun he had owned since Newport, a DeVille Bis that was older than Nora, and had been calibrated so many times it responded to his hand like an extension of it. He let each coat cure fully before applying the next. He did not rush the cure. He did not apply heat to speed it. He waited. Nora came on the Saturday of the fourth week and looked at the primed car for a long time without speaking. It was gray now, a uniform matte gray that made it look both more and less like itself. She tilted her head. "It looks like it's thinking," she said. Daniel looked at it. He supposed she was not entirely wrong. "About what?" he asked. She shrugged. "About what color it wants to be," she said. Then she sat down and opened her book. He mixed the first color the following Monday. Corinthian beige, Packard's original designation, a warm ivory gold that had to be matched from a paint chip he had sourced from the Packard Motor Car Company archives through a contact at the Auburn Cord Duesenberg Museum in Auburn, Indiana. The contact's name was Howard Reeves, and Howard was 73 years old and had spent 40 years cataloging period paint formulas with the devotion of a man who understood that color was not decoration, but history. Howard had sent the chip and the formula by registered mail with a handwritten note that said simply, "Mix it slow. It needs to breathe." Daniel had mixed it slow. He had let it breathe. The Brewster green for the lower body came from the same source, the same formula, the same slow process. He applied the colors in the correct sequence. The green first, the beige second, with a hand-cut tape line at the body crease that he measured and remeasured before he committed it. The tape line was straight. It was exactly where the factory had put it in 1951. It was, as nearly as a human hand and a calibrated eye could make it, correct. On day 26 at 11 in the morning, he pulled the tape. Pete was there. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The two tones sat in the shop light, the green deep and even across the lower body, the beige warm and precise above the crease line, the chrome trim cleaned and reinstalled the day before, the glass polished to a clarity that made the shop look larger in its reflection. "There she is," Pete said quietly. Daniel nodded. There she was. The reinstallation of the interior took 3 more days. He had sent the original broadcloth to a textile conservator in Providence named Alma Reyes, who had worked with him twice before and who had a gift for stabilizing old fabric without changing its character. Not restoration in the sense of replacement, but restoration in the sense of return. Alma had returned the pieces with a note that said the fabric had cleaned to a color she was calling Packard gray-green, original, and that she had reinforced the backing without touching the face. The pieces went back in the way they had come out, in sequence, labeled. Each one fitted with the care of something that had been made to fit exactly and had not forgotten how. The note from RTW went back beneath the rear seat cushion in its glassine envelope in its original fold. Daniel had discussed this with Gerald Fitch in a phone call on day 24. Gerald had been quiet for a long moment when Daniel told him what the note said. Then he said, "My brother never mentioned Margaret." Another silence. "Put it back," he said. "It belongs there." Daniel put it back. On day 29, he started the engine. It turned over on the third crank, caught, and settled into an idle that was even and unhurried and had the particular deep note of a straight 8 at low revs, a sound like something very old and very patient clearing its throat. Pete stood at the front of the car with his arms crossed and his head tilted slightly, listening. The idle steadied. The temperature gauge rose in a smooth arc and held at the correct position. There were no leaks. There were no rattles. There was only the engine, running the way it had been built to run. 73 years after the man with the initials RTW had pressed his mark into the firewall and left a note for Margaret beneath the seat. Daniel let it run for 20 minutes. Then he shut it off, and the shop went quiet, and he stood at the front of the car and looked at it for a long moment with his hands at his sides. He had done what he said he would do. He called Gerald Fitch at 2 in the afternoon. He told him the car was finished. Gerald asked if it was ready. Daniel said it was. Gerald was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "My brother would have liked you." Daniel said he appreciated that. The call ended. He went back to the shop and covered the car with a clean cloth. Not the old canvas tarp, but a soft cotton cover he had bought for the purpose, and he turned off the light and drove home. The Coastal Classic car, auction, opened its preview day on a Thursday morning in October, and the Packard 200 arrived in Bay 7 on a flatbed at 8:45, covered in the cotton cloth, and was uncrated and positioned by Daniel and Pete without ceremony. The auction house staff had updated the pre-sale estimate based on a revised assessment submitted by the consignor's representative. But the new estimate had not been widely circulated, and most of the people who walked through the preview that morning looked at the covered shape and did not stop. Marcus stopped. He had come early ahead of Diane, because he had been thinking about the man in May 7 since the staging day 4 months ago. And he had done what people with good instincts and access to the internet sometimes do. He had looked. He had found the Automobile Quarterly article. He had found the Callaway Coachworks client list. He had found the patent filings. He had assembled, in the quiet hours of his own time, a picture of Daniel Marsh that was substantially different from the one Diane had formed in 4 seconds in the staging bay, and he had said nothing about it to her because he was 26 and she was the CEO, and the timing had never seemed right. The timing seemed right now. He lifted the cotton cloth at the front corner, just enough to see the hood. The Corinthian beige caught the morning light, the way old paint catches it, not with a flash, but with a depth, a warmth that came from the pigment itself rather than the surface. He set the cloth back down carefully and stood up straight. He called Diane. He told her she should come to Bay 7 before the preview opened to the floor. She arrived at 9:15 in a tailored charcoal jacket, her assistant behind her, her expression carrying the particular set of a person who has been told to look at something and has not yet decided whether it will be worth her time. She looked at the covered shape. She looked at Marcus. "You called me here for a covered car," she said. "I called you here for the man who restored it," Marcus said. He handed her his phone, open to the Automobile Quarterly article. She looked at the screen. She read for a moment. Her expression did not change dramatically, but something in it shifted. The kind of shift that happens when a calculation is revised and the revision is significant. She handed the phone back. She looked at the covered car. She said, "Pull the cloth." Marcus lifted the cotton cover and folded it back, and the Packard 200 stood in the morning light of Bay 7 in its two-tone paint. Its chrome trim, its original glass, its rebuilt straight 8 sitting quiet and ready beneath the hood. And Diane Hargrove looked at it for a long time without speaking. She was not a woman who was often without words. "The estimate," she said finally. Marcus told her the revised estimate. She looked at the car again. She said, "And the man who did this is the same man who was crouching in the grease 4 months ago." Marcus said he was. Diane was quiet for a moment. That was different from ordinary quiet. It had a quality of internal adjustments to it, the kind of silence that comes from rapid recalibration. She said, "I said something at the staging about the motor oil." Marcus said nothing. "It was unkind," she said. "Not a hedge. A statement." She asked Marcus to find out if Mr. Marsh would be willing to discuss a commission, not a request relayed through the auction house. A direct conversation at his convenience. She said it precisely and without ornamentation. And then she straightened her jacket and walked toward the registration desk, and Marcus wrote the message in his phone. Daniel was in the parking lot at 9:40, having arrived with Pete in the truck, and he read the message when it came through at 9:53. He read it once, put his phone in his pocket, and walked into the auction hall. He did not answer it until the following week. He answered it with 2 sentences. He said he was available for a conversation and that she should call the shop. He said nothing else. The message was sent at 8 in the morning from the shop on Clement Street. Before Nora was awake, in the quiet hour before the garage light had fully warmed from violet to white. He drove home that evening on the same route he always drove, past the harbor where the lights were beginning to come on across the water, past the diner on Merchant Street, where the sign buzzed faintly in the October cold, past the turn onto Clement Street, where the shop sat dark and locked behind him. He had left the cotton cover on the Packard. He had left the tools clean and ordered on their cloth. He had left everything the way it should be left by a person who intended to return. Nora wasn't asleep when he got home. She had fallen asleep on the couch with Biscuit tucked under her arm and her reading book open across her chest, the page she had been on held flat by the weight of it. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her the way he sometimes looked at things he was trying to understand, not cataloging, not planning, just seeing. Then he lifted the book, marked her page with the ribbon, set it on the table, and carried her to bed. She did not wake. She made a small sound and pulled Biscuit closer and went on sleeping. He came back to the kitchen and stood at the window. The streetlight at the corner of their block cast a rectangle of pale orange across the floor, the same rectangle it cast every night, the same angle, the same color, the same quiet geometry. He had stood at this window before. He would stand at it again. He thought about what his father had told him once at the end of a long day in the garage, when Daniel was 12 years old and frustrated that he could not see what Raymond could see in the surface of a piece of metal. Raymond had set down his file and said, without drama, that seeing was not a gift. It was a practice. You looked, and you looked again, and you looked a third time, and eventually the thing revealed itself, because things always did to the person who were willing to look long enough. Daniel had spent his life proving that true. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, and the street light held its rectangle on the floor, steady and unnamed and exactly where it had always been.